Yes, thanks for having me. I definitely know some names and faces in this meeting, and others I don't. So I'm looking forward to knowing you. Um, so yes, thank you. You got my last name right. It's funny. I always have to tell people it's like Lake Powell, but with an R, or think of an owl. Try to find ways. You're one of the few people who got that right. So I have been with Local First Arizona almost a year and a half, but I was really involved with the organization about 5 years leading up to that. I was actually a board member, so did kind of an odd talent pipeline approach off the board and onto the staff. But I just loved what the organization was doing in all of its program areas. But my focus from the board was the rural program, and provided some just support and coaching to my predecessor, who some of you might have known, Liza Noland, who had led rural development about 3 years prior to that. So I'm from Cottonwood originally. My family is still there. So grew up rural, have really seen Cottonwood transformed and change a great deal since my family moved to that area. My dad was a small business owner there, so can relate to the challenges of that in rural. My mom worked in workforce development for DES and ran one stops. And so, you grow up in a family, and what your parents do impacts your life. You see that, their work hours, their struggles, their challenges, their rewards, their loves, all of that. But I've, in this work, really loved that reconnection, because so many of the needs and challenges tie right into workforce development, economic development more broadly, and certainly small business retention and expansion. So I'm just honored and thrilled to have the opportunity to professionally do what I've had a heart for personally. And I know that's how many of you are as well. Many of you are from and always rural. Others might have chosen rural, or some of you are urban, but your role is definitely supporting the entire state. So I had been to the Rural Policy Forum many times in the role of sponsor. I was with APS for 10 years before joining Local First, and they've been a longtime supporter of the organization and of the forum. So completely different coming in, and the one in Winslow in 2022 was the first one. I came in about halfway through the planning. Location had been selected, agenda was largely structured, and it was more execution. So the 2023 forum is the first one that I feel I really got to be hands-on with from start to finish. And I have to give a shout out to our friends from Miami, Evelyn and Alexis, who are on this call, because they were part of being the backbone of the success of this event. When we selected the Globe Miami area, Miami is where the forum was actually held, but it was in partnership with Globe, because for lodging and some of the add-on infrastructure, Globe needed to be in the mix as well. And it's great that the two communities work so well together. And I hope that if you were there, it felt like a seamless event and wasn't really obvious if you were in Globe or Miami. It was all tied together and part of that copper corridor culture. So if you've had the opportunity to be at the forum, first, thank you. We appreciate you supporting it, being there, attending. And if you have not, then yes, I'm hoping I can put out a little teaser through our time here and get you there in the future. And I would invite Alexis and Evelyn to jump in at any time if there's something I'm missing they'd like to add. Alexis was on the steering committee, so a big part of all of the planning and execution. So next slide, please. And thank you for driving my slides. I'm on a really small screen, so that's helpful. So Anne was exactly right that this is an annual event. It was in its 16th year this past August. It's considered a signature convening, one of the few that's in and for rural and tribal specifically. We organize it in our role as the state's federally designated Rural Development Council. That's quite a mouthful. Many of you may not even know there is such a thing. So I just wanted to spend a moment explaining that the U.S. Farm Bill in the early 1980s spelled out the role of these rural development councils. And then over time, their vibrance and viability ebbed and flowed across the country. And today, there are about 14 of them remaining in the Midwest, in the New England and Northeastern area, and New Mexico and Arizona. So what that means is we are a convening body to help work across sectors. We have a rural advisory team that represents different sectors, and we're meant to add capacity, be a resource, and also help align and advocate where we can on the policy front, but really as an extension of or amplifying on behalf of communities and tribes. It wouldn't be us there instead of them, for example. If your community felt strongly about a policy, it would be working with you on that front. So I just had the honor of going to the Partners for Rural America is the national convening entity of these councils. And we just had the national meeting in Vermont just a couple of weeks ago and learned a ton, and would be happy at any point to come back and share highlights from that if it's of interest. So what we do at the forum is we've all been to countless conferences, like name that conference, right? And they tend to follow a general format of you're going to have general sessions, you're going to have breakouts. There's some kind of networking or mixing opportunities. Then the format when you're in each session is where things can be very, very different. So that it's true that that traditional format is the case with the forum, but we really are striving to find ways to make it as interactive as possible, because the real value of the event is getting that much brain power focused on rural and tribal in the same place. So using that to only talk one way at people is not what we want to do. We're hoping to harness that intellectual capital and experience. And I don't want to imply we have done it perfectly. We are constantly looking, especially with technologies and the new ways you can interact with big crowds, how we can get better at this. So I did want to call to action here is if you've been to a conference and really loved something you've seen, or you've been to the forum and didn't give us a survey or give us your thoughts, we're very open to input on how we can make it as collaborative as possible. And that's why we do add-on activities as well. Wednesday is an unofficial start to the forum with an economic development tour of the hosting region. We climbed on a bus this year donated by Capstone and went around both Globe and Miami economic highlights, and very interactive. You're not staying on that bus, you're getting off, you're seeing and hearing about how those projects came to life. And some of them are on different parts of their journey, completed, done, operating projects. Others are still a vision. There was a housing project in Globe. The big crane was there. It was under construction. So we couldn't go inside, but we could see scale and hear about it. And then we do the 2 evening events that are meant to showcase some key locations in these communities, as well as just create that networking and mixing opportunity. And they're always high energy and a lot of fun. Next slide. I just wanted to share here by the numbers. We had a really big year at the forum this year. It's normally about 250, and we got all the way up to 340 because really we did sell out and tried to tell people no. And some said, well, I'm coming anyway, and we'll see what happens. So we were busting at the seams at some of these venues. The all in, it was 340 people who participated in some way over those 3 days. We had over 50 presenters. So grateful. We have 17 sponsors, and I just like to talk about that and even have a slide of them, because we're all doing work that it can be hard sometimes to find your funders and know who supports these types of things. So it can be helpful to share that information and point out who's behind this event. We also put the event in early August in rural places. People sometimes complain, why is it early August? It's hot. We know the school year is starting, but the reason that began, Local First has planned this forum for the last 10 years. And in rural communities, that time period can tend to be a shoulder month, a valley instead of a peak for many of the local businesses. A little different if you're in North Country, right? And it's high season and people are there enjoying cooler temps, but elsewhere in rural, business owners said that's a tough month. And if you can bring crowds here and help drive our revenues, you can be helping us get all the way through August. So that is the reason it is when it is. And we put it where we put it. Being a forum for rural, we believe very strongly it should be in rural. And Evelyn was key, along with many others, in recruiting volunteers. And these events, it's people doing everything from helping park cars to being on stage presenting. So it was a great team effort with a lot of local engagement from different independent volunteers, like people who onesie twosie step forward to be involved. And then all in on the right side there, we had every county represented, 45 plus from a mix of what you see on the screen there, tribal, municipal, more of like your governmental, if you will, and 120 plus of other organizations, largely nonprofits. If we go to the next slide, I just attempted to break that down a little bit more for you, that you can see there in the red. Some people put themselves broadly in that bucket of I do community development. That was about a third of the attendees. And then government, about 15%. And that surprises people sometimes. They think, oh, this is probably mostly government because it's called Policy Forum, and they're good representation there, but not the majority of folks. And then you can see nonprofits were really strong this year as well in the mix. And then our goal is to steadily increase tribal participation. And we've realized this is the Rural Policy Forum, but rural is not an all-encompassing word. And we've talked with tribes around the fact that we're tribal, we're sovereign, we're distinct. So I don't know if we'll get to that point of actually changing the forum name to account for that, but it's certainly a goal to be inclusive of tribes and cover topics that advance what they're working on as well. Next slide. This is a busy slide, but what I wanted to do, especially if you weren't at the forum, is point out on the left what our stops were on the economic development tour, because this is an area, Globe Miami, if you're not familiar, rich in history, really interesting history with beautiful historic buildings. Also a traditionally and historically mining community, hence the copper corridor. So the mining operations and development, a big part of the history, but also the current economy. But then so much revitalization focused on the community and quality of life and placemaking is going on in both Miami and Globe, that it was really hard. This was one of our tours with the most stops. We crammed it in because there was so much to see and so much going on. And a highlight, if you haven't been there, was truly downtown Miami was the last stop. And Pin Drop Trailers chose downtown Miami. They are building these really cool custom-made RVs right there in downtown Miami. And then there's now the Lyric Soda Fountain, antique stores, galleries. You have to get off the 60. Just if you're coming from Phoenix, take that left and one street over. Really great stuff is happening. So that was a highlight. We got such high scores for the tour, and people wished more folks could have participated. And then over on the right, that's the 2 days of the forum program that you can see a variety of topics covered here. I'm going to quickly just work my way across some highlights. At the top, we were thrilled to have the tribal land acknowledgement that we try to do, every year to kick off that inclusion of tribes and make sure it's understood this event is for them as well. David Cook gave the legislative district update to tell us about news from the district, but also federally and nationally, things he's been involved with and what he's working on. We were really thrilled to have Marin Mahoney with the Office of Resiliency being so new. She was really looking for access to rural leaders like this to share what the priorities of that office have been. And I will tell you, there was a line to the microphone during Q&A with her. Some of it really tough questions, right? Pointed questions, not at her, but about, where the resources are needed, what rural hopes to see and needs. And so we're continuing to work closely with Director Mahoney in that office on how we can connect the resources to rural, and as they're designing programs, have them with rural in mind. On the second row, the two things I just wanted to mention is we took a risk with this event to make one afternoon not a series of breakouts, but rather hands-on workshops of the whole large crowd, like a general session. And we brought in strategic doing, which is a method and a practice that's really gained a lot of attention in the economic development space. Essentially, there's a lot of fatigue with planning and creating these robust, hefty plans that sit on a shelf. And they tend to follow a military approach that assumes there's a hierarchy of decision-making and resource management. But when you're doing a plan that needs to involve more than one community or many parties, they're not in that military kind of hierarchy where somebody gets to say, you go do this. across and over with resources they don't control. Strategic doing breaks some of that down and just gets more straight into the doing, starting with what you have. So it also prevents the, oh, woe is me, with all the challenges and barriers that are important, but tries to move past that and say, but what have we got? We've got strengths and assets, and let's start from there. This got really high marks as well. There were some people who said, not really my bag to work that way all afternoon, but mostly people really loved this and gave it high marks. So I wanted to let this group know we're hoping to do some follow-on convenings in that vein. Liz Nielsen, our keynote, is probably going to join us in the November timeframe. That will invite everybody who was at the forum back to a virtual convening to keep the conversation going about how to advance the practice of strategic doing in Arizona. And then decoding infrastructure funding, I know that's a key area of interest to this particular group. And that was a very popular session as well, where we had housing, water, energy, and I feel like, and transportation represented, and talked through different grants, loans, funding streams for those areas of infrastructure. And I would love anybody who's not familiar with the Arizona Economic Recovery Center and our free grant readiness, grant writing, and project implementation services, please do connect with me afterwards, because a lot of this infrastructure funding, we all know, is already on the table, but lots more is still coming. And for example, the US DOT Thriving Communities program just reopened. So that's a complex one to navigate. And we really want to start turning our focus from the Recovery Center on helping Arizona put competitive teams together. So sometimes your own community going it alone, you will struggle to compete federally, because just unfortunately your population or impact numbers might be small once you hit that federal level. But if you join forces with a neighboring community and can regionalize some, that might really help overall the share of money Arizona can win into the state. So that was some of what that session was about. And I won't go through all of these because we don't have time, but if you weren't there and you see a topic of interest and something you're working on, please reach out. We shared with all the forum attendees a link to all of the presentation materials. I'm happy to share that with anyone here as well if you weren't actually at the event. And next slide, I wanted to share, this was the framing question for strategic doing. It starts there, and these groups that work together all did this one question around imagining if young people in our communities prospered, and if young adults chose rural and wanted to make their homes in your community, what would that look like? So all of their collaboration and energy centered around that question, and coming up with a host of different projects that many teams are continuing to work on together to implement after the forum, which is what we hoped for, and is great to see. And next slide. So overall, got great ratings this year, 4.3. It's funny that the ones who gave a 2 that you see there, that was because they didn't love having to be that interactive all afternoon in strategic doing primarily. But otherwise, most people, gave it high marks. We just like to share that because it shows you can pull off really successful events in rural places and historic buildings and maybe non-traditional venues, and people have a great time. And next slide. Again, just wanted to show you our sponsors, if you can advance one more, because it just helps you to see who's out there supporting work and doing work in rural. Some of these names would be very familiar, I'm sure, and others maybe not. And we really loved that Gila Community College, for example, said, hey, we want to get in on this because you're in our backyard. And we made them part of the tour as well. And then one of our newer sponsors was Viasat, who is looking at a program to donate internet satellite service to rural areas where fiber is not coming anytime soon. So they donated putting hardware and the internet service to the venue where the forum was held in Miami, and donated it free through October. So that was really cool to see. And now we're on their radar as a state and with some rural communities for the program they're designing right now. And I think if we go to next slide, yeah, that's what I had on the forum. This is just some fun photos. I love getting photos of people taking photos. You see the mayor of Winslow there, the pink shirt on the upper left, getting her selfie. But we were, again, just packed. I mean, people were in there, and I love the rural crowd, because you see the gal on the lower right is smiling there, even though everybody's knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder. It's all about getting all we can out of the time together. So I talked really fast. I apologize, but I wanted to be mindful of the time I had allotted, and hope I haven't gone too long. And if time allows, happy to take questions.